Welcome to season 2 of What Sales Can Learn From. In this season, we're taking a little bit of a different approach. And we're going to be talking with today's most successful sales leaders, not to find out what makes them so great, but where did they mess up that made them where they are today? What lessons have they learned from their mistakes? Because as Otto von Bismarck said, it is a fool who learns from his own mistakes. It's a wise man who learns from the mistakes of others. So subscribe to the channel, and if you've missed last season, check it out on the channel, What Sales Can Learn From Season 1. Here we go. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this next episode of What Sales Can Learn From. And today we are going to be talking about sales and marketing alignment, or marketing, as it's been called in the past decade or so. It's something that a lot of companies are still struggling with, which is why I am thrilled to have Sham Sao with me today. Hi, Sham. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Carole. Great to be here.
Absolutely incredible that you are, because you have a ton of experience, both in the sales world and in the marketing world. You've grown organizations from 3 million to 20 million, from 15 to 75, all the way up from 350 to 450. And including all kinds of roles, from general manager to CRO to CMO. You've been at McKinsey & Company, and you're advising companies today. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my main thing is being GM of ThinkCell, which is software for presentation and visualization, but I also advise a number of other companies. And I feel pretty fortunate, as you mentioned. I actually started out a little bit more on the marketing side. Well, I started out at McKinsey early on, but then rolled into the marketing side. But even then, I was always very involved in the sales side of things, working hand in hand with my sales colleagues. And I started taking over business development and then moving into sales roles. So I'm really feel fortunate to have had an opportunity to see both sides.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've had in common. I started a lead generation company and then went into sales coaching and consulting, focusing on alignment, and now strictly focusing on in sales improvement. So we have some things in common, which was what caught my eye about your LinkedIn post. You were talking about prospecting into target accounts at the level which really highlighted a lot of sales and marketing, which of course makes sense because I've interviewed Navy SEALs, CIA agents, FBI directors in our last season. And I can tell you that this is a strategy that sounds a lot like what they're doing. If you're in high stakes scenario, preparation, practice, all towards that target objective, right? It's the only way that we're going to win everything over. So what's your view on how this sales and marketing alignment impacts growth in companies that are really focused on high velocity growth?
Yeah, it's really one of the most critical things. It's interesting you pointed out that post, because that post actually wasn't meant to be about sales and marketing. It was actually, as you said, meant to be about prospecting, right? And it's so integral to everything that it actually became a substantial part of that post, even though that wasn't the original idea. And in terms of quantifying impact, it's hard to quantify these kinds of things, right? How do you take an org that has bad sales and marketing alignment and compare it against one that you can't really put these things into a test tube, right? Mm-hmm. But there's some data I've seen. Actually, I think it was on Zoom Info's website, and they pulled stats from a few different places: Marketing Profs, Marketo, Sirius, Aberdeen, etc.
Yeah.
The stats, they were a little bit all over the place, but they really were consistent in that they all showed significant value. So 30%, 38% higher win rates, 36% higher customer retention, 24% increase in growth rates. Some of them were even higher, right? So they're all over, and which makes sense because different organizations are different. But to me, what's critical is both in terms of the results as well as the impact on people, it was significant.
So it's interesting that you said people. My view on sales and marketing alignment has always been, it's kind of like parents who are divorcing. They're arguing, but the person who's actually being hurt by all of that is the kid in the middle. And in this case, that kid is the buyer. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about, those numbers are huge, but when you talk about the people at the end, can you tell me a little bit more what you mean about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you said. It's the buyer. It's also the organization's ability to adapt, right? Because in the orgs that we work with, it's not usually a straight path. Even when you're consistently growing, there's still zigzags, right? And so what happens when you have sales and marketing misalignment is beyond the numbers, the teams just aren't as happy, right? Some people might become disengaged because they feel like the other team's always going to blame them no matter what. There's
Mhm.
friction happening. The meetings aren't as, nobody wants to go to the meetings anymore because there's all this finger pointing, right? But when you get the teams aligned and they start really working well together, not only do the numbers look better, but it makes people more relaxed. It lets them take risks. It makes them more creative. So when you get those obstacles that we always get in these kinds of companies, people are more free thinking to really say, okay, no problem. We've got an obstacle. How do we work together and break it down? And they're just more thoughtful to come up with ideas and keep trudging forward, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is that the teams have naturally different things they're good at, right? So sales is really good at understanding a value prop and how it can be tailored to the person you're talking to, right? Marketing is really good at things like A/B testing or segmented value props. And when you put them both together and they work together, they can really solve problems that you couldn't solve with one team really working on it.
Yeah. And if I can add one thing to that, it would be you mentioned the creativity and the innovation that can happen within the teams. And when they're aligned together and they're all also in alignment with the buyer, I look at it as an opportunity for insights to come more clearly from the buyer through sales and into marketing for things like even product development or, new packaging of services, being able to not just keep pace with the customer, but being able to even anticipate needs, staying ahead of the market. I think that's one of those benefits to sales and marketing alignment that we don't pay enough attention to. So what are some of the reasons or things that you've seen that create this misalignment? If there's so much benefit to it, why are we still struggling to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's one cause that I start to see, or that I'm starting to see dissipate a little bit, which I'm glad. And that one is that the teams never really tried to get aligned to begin with, right? That does still happens to some degree,
Mhm.
but thankfully I would say that's happening less. And most teams say, okay, we do need to work together, and they at least try to get aligned, right? So when you look at the teams that at least are trying to get aligned, there are still three or four different things that happen. So the first one is what I would call the devil's in the details. And by that, I would mean that, yeah, they're aligned at the high level, right? So the market definition, maybe it's the same vertical they've agreed upon or same high level market segmentation, but they're not aligned at the next level down, right? So when you talk about what specific pain points or attributes do you need to see from a customer for it to be a good fit, they might not really have even talked about it or written it down. So that's the first thing is just they just haven't gone down deep enough. They're sort of at the surface level of alignment.
Mhm.
The next one is really what happens when, say, they've gotten alignment. Where I see misalignment start to happen is when an organization gets really pushed to drive accelerated growth. And what happens here is marketing ends up trying to generate new sources of leads from places that it has not tapped before, right? And then what happens is either those leads aren't the same quality, because it's pretty hard when you're going after new lead sources to make sure that they're exactly uniformly the same quality as what you've been doing before and you're trying new stuff. It's pretty
Mhm.
hard. It's not going to happen all the time.
Yeah.
So there's got to be alignment to see, okay, which ones are good, which ones are not good. Be willing to get the feedback, be willing to adjust. The other is even if the leads are the same quality, but they might be a slightly different value prop that was emphasized from what you were looking at before, the way you follow up on those might need to be slightly different. And if we don't, then there's going to feel like there's misalignment. And in both of these instances, what happens is sales just feels like the leads are junk, right? Like feels
Mhm.
like the numbers are going up, but it's junk. And as soon as you have sales start to feel like the marketing leads are junk, that's where everything breaks down. So you got to stop and come back and say, okay, why are they junk? What's happening? Is it all? Is it some? Is it because we're just not used to these? And then tackle it from there, right?
Yeah. So it sounds like not just at a high level, okay, we're aligned in these propositions, but then also even bringing that down into writing it down, putting the details to it, but then also being able to be timely with that. Because like you said, if marketing's doing A/B testing, there's going to be some very frequent touch points with sales as that campaign's rolling out to see how it's going and how it's working. So we're not just talking once a month meetings, we're talking weekly, if not more, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go into this more, but I've typically had at least weekly, and I've actually found it valuable to have it twice, but once where sales is running it and once where marketing is running it, so they can
Mhm.
both sort of bring their own stuff to the table. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I know we're going to get into more about how you stay aligned. There's
Yeah.
one more thing that on this topic around misalignment that comes up, and that's also when the strategy evolves or changes, right? So, and both these things, the meetings help with all these things, right? Because what happens is if you're growing and you have new sources of leads, if there's not good willingness to talk, then there's just this shutdown of the marketing leads or junk. But if the teams are talking, you can say, okay, which leads are bad and why, right? Same
Mhm.
thing if the strategy starts to change, right? If you start to expand after a new market segment, there's going to be some things that are different, and the teams just need to look at how those are working and how they're different from what they've been used to and how they can adapt.
It's almost as if the strategy needs to include, all right, here's what we want it to look like, and here's what we're going to do if it all blows up.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times we see strategies where ideally this is what we're going to do, and ideally this is what's going to happen. But in reality, we don't have a plan for, okay, what if it doesn't work? What information do we need in order to make a right decision, to pivot, to move? And you're talking with high growth companies, earlier stage to mid stage, that's absolutely going to happen all the time.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
let's take like a semi half step back and talk about process for a minute. How do we use, or what process have you used to drive alignment between teams? Because it seems like it really does need to get granular at some point. Where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, it goes in both directions, right? First thing is it does have to start at the top. I mean, we've probably all seen examples of companies where, especially the most brilliant CEOs, have lots of good ideas, right? And they might just go to marketing and say, "Hey, can you do this?" Right? And if if the teams aren't aligned on that, so first thing is that's great. Does that mean we should go do that right this second? Or does it mean we should do it in like a month, right? It doesn't mean we're going to do it in a year, but should it be sort of 30 days from now where we say, okay, CEO's got a great idea. It does align with our strategy. Let's put together a play that gets marketing and sales so we can tackle it together, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, what happens is somebody in marketing just starts to go run the thing the CEO wanted, right? So the key is having the alignment first at the top to say, what is our strategy? When we have a new idea, how do we do it? Or do we have some tolerance to say, if it's a fundamental change, can we wait 30 days or 60 days to get everything aligned to push it out? Sometimes you can't. That's okay. If as long as the company knows, okay, we're gonna pivot this on a 1 week thing because it's critical. You gotta just gotta put pause on everything, get everyone together, and realize that this is that kind of thing, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Same with the not just the CEO, the other rest of the executive team. I've just also seen too many times where an executive team member with all good wishes and goodwill will say something to somebody in sales and marketing, and the person feels like, oh, it's great, and I want to show this person I'm action oriented, so I go and do it, right? But what about the rest of the team? What about everybody else? Like they need to come along with it too. So
Right.
how do you make sure that if it's a great idea, that it gets instituted the right way? And as you said, there's a couple of different levels at which the disconnect can happen. One is the strategy itself may need some refinement, right, to get it exactly right. The second is the strategy might be solid, but the execution or the programs you had in place might need some optimization so that you're not changing the strategy, but you're optimizing, say, we can make this happen through this set of webinars, or we can make it through these whatever, right? And you might need to test the two to see which ones really work. That's an execution test, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm so glad that you brought that up too, because one of the things that I see happen a lot is that the executive team develops a strategy, and then it's up to the frontline managers and salespeople and marketing professionals to be able to execute on that strategy. And when it doesn't work, the first thing that gets blamed is the strategy. Oh, the strategy didn't work. Without ever really taking into consideration, does the team have the necessary tools, mindsets, and skills to actually execute on that strategy before we decide, oh, it's the strategy that's wrong? I think we have to look at it from both sides. So let's
Absolutely.
talk a little bit about how to make sure we stay aligned. Let's assume that at this point we've overcome some of these hurdles that we've talked about. How do we stay that? What works best in what you've seen?
Yeah, so I'll touch back to the thing we were talking about before, where some place I've seen it work best is literally having bi-weekly meetings with sales and marketing. They don't have to be long, and I'm not a believer in wasting time in meetings, so they could be stand-ups, right? They could be two half-an-hour stand-ups.
Hmm.
They could be meetings where you might end it in 10 minutes, right? If you get everything done that you need to get done, right? And so, but the value of having them to have the value of having marketing run one and sales run one is, so in one of them, you can use that meeting to say, here's what marketing is planning, right, for the next week, the next month, et cetera. Here's the reason why we're doing these things. Here's the programs. You can ideally you send them out before the meeting, right? So you
Right.
shoot that stuff out and say, here's what we're planning. Take a quick look, make the meeting as efficient as possible. You come to it, marketing talks a little bit more about it. Sales can then push on and pressure test it, right? Well, did you think about this? Do we want to do that? And they can agree or disagree on certain things, right? They can make some refinements.
Yeah.
Uh, they can also present what they're seeing from leads coming in. Another one that's, I think, really important is the follow-up cadence of leads, right? So if there's an expectation that leads are going to be called within 10 minutes, certain kinds of leads, and they're going to be followed up 7 times, well, then marketing should have that dashboard, right? And they can share it. And when we meet, you can say, hey, guys, we had this sort of 10-minute target and it's at 2 hours now, right? Do we think that could be causing an issue, right? And then sales might say, well, there's too many things coming in. We can't call them in 10 minutes. Then we might say, okay, should we hone it down to just people that press this particular interest button that say they're really interested now? Maybe those ones need to be called in 10 minutes, right? So it's that kind of interchange that needs to happen, right?
Yep.
And
Yeah.
then with sales leading, it's also good because they can give feedback on what they're feeling from the leads. And this is one where I've asked the sales team to just collect some data, but also some anecdotes, right? To say, and you got to have both. You can't just come and be like, yeah, we heard 3 or 4 people say this, right? But it's got to be like, here's the data of what we're seeing, and then here's some more sort of colored context around that.
Yeah. And I also love the idea too, having been in the marketing side, working with sales teams, one of the things that I would do a lot in those situations was get campaign ideas from them. So what are some of the things that are happening in your industry and with your customers, and actually brainstorm what might be some marketing campaigns that work. And then sales feels like, this isn't just being something that they're handing to us, they're actually collaborating with you on it. So there's a lot of great techniques like that.
Yeah.
Now, we talked a little bit too before about how this alignment can help us not just keep in tune with buyers, but even anticipate market needs. And buyers are evolving faster than ever. It's not going to slow down anytime soon. What do you think is the best way to iterate the process so that we're keeping buyer-focused intel front and center?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's that feedback loop that we had talked about. So with sales, why are they buying? Why are they not buying? And I love your comment about feeding that into the campaigns. I'd say feeding in joint design of campaigns and even marketing, running the campaigns by sales early on before they go build out the whole thing. They can get a lot of good ideas. But the feedback loop that comes from the buyers is critical, and that hits what you were talking about. So there's a few different kinds of change that can happen. So in my experience, there's definitely changes that happen in buyers, but it's not really super frequent, right? If it's happening every month, it's probably something weird going on, right? It's probably more like you just didn't understand the market properly, because most markets don't change that often, and that's okay if you don't fully understand it. You just got to call it out and say, hey, look, we're still learning this market. And part of what we're doing is getting this data back so we can refine what we need to learn. I think it's really important to be systematic about that. If you're learning about a market, lay out the things that you don't really understand and the things that you want to test, and test them systematically, right? That's most likely what's happening. Is it's the market's not changing as rapidly. Your understanding of the market's changing. Now, it is the case that the markets can change still. So when does that happen? Like, so this is a good example in a pandemic, right? The market changes. The way people are buying, the kind of things they spend money on change, right? So it might also change by season, a new year, it might change. So there are definitely points in time when you get this change. And what's critical there as well is to understand, for the teams to bring back and say, what do we see happening in the market? Have sales' view of it, have marketing's view of it, both of them bringing back data points, and then building a picture of what they see happening so they can then come back and decide how they want to attack that together.
Yeah. I have this picture in my mind of, some secret op mission where you have trained fighters out in the field coming back and saying to someone in the ops van, okay, I need data on this. Is like that's the whole image that kind of runs through my head on it.
Yeah.
So when teams are doing this together, they're going to stay aligned. And you've probably seen this. I've seen this at a high level. how does a founder, how does an executive tell when there's alignment happening and when there isn't alignment happening? And really, what can they do about it as a first step?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times the way the metrics are talked about, right, is you can see in a meeting where there's metrics and there's holes in the way people are talking about it, or marketing shows this really great chart of everything looking green and the sales numbers look like this, right? So when you see these just disjointed numbers, that's a good clue.
Yeah.
Obviously when there's pure finger pointing, but a lot of people are nice enough where they don't get that rude in the meeting. They might go say it after the meeting's over or at the water cooler. It's actually better if they say it right at the meeting, right? But it's hard to sort of be that blunt. The reality is actually when you hear people raise it in a constructive way, even though that feels like there's friction, that's actually good. That shows that there's alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Sales says, hey, we had this batch of leads come in, the conversion seems to be lower on them, especially if they're open to the fact that we should explore, maybe we should be following up on them differently, but maybe we need to look if they're this, if it's that kind of discussion, it's really positive, right? The other
Yeah.
thing I think is really valuable is I really think it's important for these leaders to have real relationships with each other. So I had this instance once. This was actually between RevOps and sales, where we had a new RevOps person in sales, and there was friction, right? They
Mm-hmm.
weren't getting along, and I basically said, "You guys need to go have beers together 4 times, and then after you go do that, come back and tell me how it's going, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
you also don't, you can't talk just about work when you go do that. You need to go talk about other stuff and learn about each other and then talk about work. They just weren't meshing well together. And, but when they really got to know each other and they worked a little differently, right? Like once they saw, oh, you work like this, I work like this, but we're
Mm-hmm.
both good people and now we know it. And the same thing, whether it's those two functions, whether it's sales or marketing, it's you've got to have that kind of ability. And if you don't, it's going to be hard, right? If you,
Yeah.
I've seen situations where, for whatever reason, the personalities just don't click, and you can't get them to click. If you can't really get them to at least sort of be willing to connect with each other that way, it does become difficult.
It becomes difficult. It becomes toxic. It starts to spread throughout the teams. I've seen it happen myself. And I think it's really important to, as a leader, as a CEO, as a founder, to look at, what is the emotional intelligence of our teams? What's the level of empathy, those soft skills that we really need to develop now, I think, just as much as ever. And I also wonder if it also has to do a little bit with the kind of culture that's in the organization. Like, do you have a true learning organization type of a culture where no one feels like they're being, they don't feel like they need to be defensive when they make a mistake, that they can be open and honest, like, you know what, we really messed this up, but here's like a way forward. If you don't have the kind of culture that not just allows that, but actually encourages it, I think it's really going to be a strong battle uphill
Mhm.
trying to align sales and marketing teams together.
Yeah, and I think that holds true. That's a good one that holds across the company, right?
Right.
And I've seen CEOs get better and better about this. I think in the past we had seen these cultures, and it still happens. I shouldn't say in the past. It was much more prevalent in the
Right.
past, right? But these cultures where people would be afraid and freaked out about making a mistake, right? And they would hide data and all this kind of stuff, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it starts with the top to say, look, if you make a mistake and you come forward on it and are clean, like that's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. If you make the same mistake 17 times, yeah, we're probably going to need to talk, probably less than 17, right? But if
Yeah.
you keep making the same mistake over and over again, yeah, that probably isn't a great thing, right?
Yeah.
But if you're being smart, right, and you're making some mistakes, that's what happens to everybody, right?
Right. And
Um,
that's what the whole theme of this season of what sales can learn from is all about, is about being able to not just learn from our mistakes, but the mistakes of others.
yeah,
So here's the hot seat question for you. You ready?
sure.
All right. So out of all of the things we've talked about, we've all gone through the things where we've learned from our own mistakes. So what is a big mistake either that you've made or that you've seen be made, and what was learned from it that the rest of us can learn from? And it can be in relation to sales and marketing alignment or anything.
Yeah, I would say to me, the one I've seen from my teams as well as from other companies that I would advise is this one about when you're really pushing the pedal to the metal and you are putting pressure on marketing to really drive up the leads,
Hmm.
that you have to put extra focus on understanding those leads that are those new leads that are coming, and be collaborative, and have sales needs to understand too, right? That we need to collaborate together to make these new sources be productive. And it's not just because sales has got the high goals too, right?
Hmm.
And that's the place where I've seen, because, and maybe it's just because I work a lot with companies that have high growth goals, but those are the ones where, the CEO has high expectations. You see this plan that looks like this, marketing is going like this, and they usually get there, but there's usually some friction that happens where this big pile of leads comes in and people have some pain and sorting through that and how they work on that. So, when you're getting ready to ramp, that's the time where you need to talk about the upcoming potential misalignment, right? And how do we
Right.
prepare to make sure that that doesn't happen to us?
Right. And don't forget that as those leads increase, if you're not also investing in developing the abilities of your sellers and managers to deal with those different type of leads or style of leads or sales process, you're expecting, but you're not actually supporting. So we're going to make sure that there's alignment there too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know you do a lot of coaching with teams as well, and that's critical too, right? And it may be the case that a sales team needs to have two or three different avenues of addressing different kinds of leads now, right? And that needs to be agreed on up front. I've seen also some instances where a sales team doesn't want to do that. And it may be with good reason. It may be that the skill set of the team is such that if they've got this homogeneous path that they need to put people through to keep
Mhm.
their throughput and their velocity high, and if they have to start adapting all over the place, then it messes up their cadence, right?
Right.
And so if that's the case, then maybe it's pulling out a special team, right? Maybe you've got two or three reps that are more nimble, that have been with the company or just get it more. And you say, okay, we're going to give this new lead pool to this pool of reps here, right? And see if they can learn how to, leverage this pool of leads. So doing things like that and saying, not just trying to force it and jam it down and say, we're just going to make the sales team do it. Sometimes they can't, right? Sometimes not
Right.
everybody out there is going to be able to do it right away. Sometimes you might need to give them a month of coaching before they can. Sometimes you might need to pull out some people. So what do you do to make it work, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't just force it.
Yeah, so you've got to be able to match lead type to skill set, put alignment there, but then
Mm-hmm.
also look at if you're projecting growth and you're putting this demand on marketing, you've also got to expect that if you've got a group of team that they're really good in handling inbound leads and now you want them to prospect enterprise deals, there's going to need to be a learning curve factored in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily guesswork. You can actually align skill sets to those types of things, but you've got to factor those things in, otherwise you're going to burn out your team and your team's going to churn, and then it gets even more expensive for growth.
Yeah, and on the flip side with marketing as well, right? So if marketing knows there's a cost to sales of different kinds of things that I go after, right?
Right.
And so can I focus on some programs that have similar kinds of outputs? Because yes, for marketing, it may be, nice to go and do 15 different kinds of tests, right? And pull on 15 different kinds of leads. But it's probably unrealistic to expect the sales team to be able to absorb those kinds of different leads. If you can bucket them and say, okay, there's really three buckets of these are all similar, these are all similar, these are all similar, and I think the way we can follow up on those, and so we have three paths,
Yeah.
that just makes it more amenable. So, I think that both teams need to realize the cost for each other, right? So sales needs to realize, hey, marketing's got this really steep thing. They're going to need to experiment, right? So we're going to need to work with them, because otherwise we as and the org can't expect them to just magically make up these leads that are the same exact quality. It's not going to happen, right?
Right.
And on the flip side, marketing's got to realize, okay, sales has got to take these things and absorb them and convert them. So we've got to have some mechanism to create some homogeneity between these things. Because if we just throw all these different things at them and don't have good bucketing, they're not going to be able to absorb and convert them. We can't just point the finger in sales and say, well, we gave you all this stuff you didn't convert.
Yeah. And it's almost like creating specialized teams or pods. So if you have these three different pathways, let's create and match skill set and have marketing and organize it that way. And I think the experimentation, the iteration, the feedback loop, when you have it broken out into smaller teams and pods, becomes a lot easier to manage and even compare and contrast to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like another whole topic we can go down though.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Any final parting words for anyone who's looking to either get in touch with you or figure out where to start with this sales and marketing alignment piece?
Sure. I mean, I think like all of us, I'm on LinkedIn, right? And
Yes.
so, and I would say, in terms of starting with sales and marketing, you know, it starts with a conversation and just really being open about being real about it and saying, look, we've got to have a real working relationship. It can't be like one of these relationships where, you're sort of afraid to say things about the other, group or what's happening. It's you got to like really get to know the teams and work at it together. And I think, I think what we did here is a good roadmap. I think we talked about what are the different kinds of alignment mistakes that can happen in the areas. So I think you're going to have a transcript of this, right?
Yes, we're going to have a transcript of this for everyone later on. It's going to be on our blog. We'll have links so that the people can get in touch with you and learn more about that and follow you on LinkedIn and other social media. So I have a feeling this will be another conversation that we probably have again.
Yeah, we can continue the discussion, but I think the resource you're making available is great because those points about the kinds of misalignment, if you can
Yeah,
understand where the misalignment happens and be just vigilant looking for it, as well as building those processes that help you keep it, that's more than half the battle. So it's
I
great
think
that
so.
those resources will be available and people can dig into those.
John, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone will be including links for you to be able to get in touch, learn more about Sham and sales and marketing alignment. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carole. Have a good one.
You too. Stay tuned for our next episode by subscribing to the Sales Experts channel or the Unbound Growth blog and YouTube channel. Let's continue the conversation there or on the Sales Experts LinkedIn group. Check the attachments for links to both and to follow our guests on social media and their websites. Until next time.